What if the Anunnaki were not remembered through stories of power, but through silence? What if their greatest decision was not to rule, not to stay, but to step aside quietly as the world changed around them? Across ancient landscapes, we find no final messages, no declarations, only broken tablets, empty cities, and memories that seem intentionally unfinished. Perhaps they were not meant to be worshipped. Perhaps they were meant to be forgotten, so that something new could begin without their shadow. Tonight, this is not a story about gods or disasters. It is a reflection on what happens when a civilization chooses silence and allows memory to fade. Gently, listen closely. Because some histories do not speak loudly, there are moments in deep time that do not announce themselves with fire or collapse. Moments that leave no broken stone or burned horizon behind them, but instead pass so quietly that only the faintest echo remains, like a breath held too long and then released without sound. When we imagine ancient ages, we often imagine endings that are loud and final. Yet there is another possibility, one that lingers beneath the noise of myth and memory, suggesting that some ages did not end so much as they gently stepped aside. In the oldest stories, preserved not in clear sentences but in fragments, pauses, and silences between words, there is a sense that something once present chose to become absent, not destroyed, not defeated, but withdrawn, as if a presence once woven deeply into the rhythms of the world slowly loosened its grip and allowed the fabric to settle on its own. This kind of departure leaves no single moment to point to, no clear line between before and after. It leaves only a quiet uncertainty, passed down through generations, who could feel that something had changed, even if they could no longer name what it was. What remains most striking in these inherited memories is not what is said, but what is avoided. The spaces where explanation should be, but is not. The careful way later cultures speak around certain ideas, as though direct language might disturb something better left undisturbed. It is within these silences that the thought emerges that the Anunnaki, if they existed as memory suggests rather than as fact, may not have vanished in catastrophe or conflict, but instead chose a far more subtle ending. Rather than ruling forever, rather than remaining visible and central, they may have stepped aside, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually enough that their absence could be mistaken for forgetting. A withdrawal paced slowly enough that those who followed could believe the world had always been this way, guided only by human hands and human choices. In this possibility, the most important act was not what they did while present, but how they chose to leave. Memory does not always preserve power clearly. Sometimes it softens it. Sometimes it turns authority into distance, and distance into myth, over long stretches of time. Direct remembrance becomes uncomfortable, even dangerous, because it challenges the idea that humanity has always stood alone. And so memory adapts. It reshapes itself into stories that are easier to carry, easier to repeat, without unsettling the present. If the Anunnaki were remembered at all, perhaps it was never meant to be through worship or monument. Perhaps remembrance was meant to survive only through absence, through a sense that knowledge once existed that no longer fits cleanly into human hands. Knowledge that if held too tightly could slow growth rather than encourage it. In that sense, silence becomes not a failure of memory, but its final instruction. There are patterns in ancient traditions that hint at this kind of departure, not a sudden abandonment, but a gradual loosening of guidance. A world once shaped with direct intervention slowly shifting into one. Tools remained, but instructions faded. Symbols survived, but meanings blurred. What was once spoken directly became suggestion, metaphor, and eventually mystery. This kind of stepping aside would require restraint greater than domination. If such beings existed, then their final act may not have been creation or destruction, but trust. Trust that humanity, even imperfect and uncertain, would find its way without constant oversight. In this light, silence is no longer empty, it is deliberate. It is the space left open so that new voices can emerge without being drowned out by older ones. The Anunnaki, remembered through this lens, become less like rulers and more like distant teachers who knew when to stop speaking. Their disappearance, rather than signaling failure or defeat, becomes an act of completion. Over generations, this silence would have grown heavier, not lighter. As direct memory faded, it would leave behind a pressure, a sense that something important had been set down and not picked back up. Civilizations would rise into this quiet, building stories to explain why certain questions felt too large. Myths would form not to preserve facts, but to soothe the discomfort of partial remembering. In these myths, the Anunnaki would appear briefly, often at the beginning, and then retreat into the background. They would be present enough to explain a sense of inherited order, but distant enough to avoid challenging human autonomy. Over time, even these stories would fragment, leaving only traces: names without context, Zos without clarity, power without instruction. What is forgotten first is not presence, but intention, why they were there, why they left. Without intention, memory becomes unstable. It drifts toward fear or reverence, depending on what the present needs. It cannot be easily reshaped, only ignored. And so the deepest layer of remembrance may not exist in story at all, but in an unspoken sense that something stepped back so something else could step forward. A forgotten age does not necessarily vanish. It sinks, it settles beneath later layers, influencing them quietly. Language changes, customs shift, but underlying patterns remain. A preference for gradual order over sudden revelation. A lingering belief that knowledge should be earned slowly rather than given fully formed. These are not rules taught directly, but habits inherited unconsciously. It was folded inward, its lessons embedded rather than displayed. This would explain why so many ancient cultures seem to circle around the same themes without fully articulating them. The sense of a prior completeness, the feeling that something once knew more than it chose to say. Silence in this context becomes a form of communication extended across time, not a message meant to be decoded quickly, but a condition meant to shape development. By withholding clarity, it invites exploration. By avoiding dominance, it encourages experimentation. But by navigating uncertainty, this kind of inheritance is difficult to recognize because it lacks spectacle. There is no single moment where silence begins. It grows naturally as memory fades, as generations reinterpret what they have received. The Anunnaki, if remembered at all, become shadows at the edge of thought, not figures to be confronted, but absences to be felt. And perhaps that was the point. A forgotten age is not one that failed, but one that succeeded so completely that it no longer needed to be remembered clearly. Its influence persists precisely because it does not demand recognition. It allows later ages to believe they are discovering truths for the first time, even as they unknowingly follow paths gently cleared long before. In this way, stepping aside is not retreat, but completion. The work ends, not with a declaration, but with quiet withdrawal. The Anunnaki fade not into darkness, but into background, into silence. And within that silence, humanity learns to listen, not for voices from above, but for the slow unfolding. Silence, once accepted, begins to shape the way time is felt rather than measured. It stretches moments and softens edges, allowing memory to drift instead of anchoring itself to fixed points. In such a world, the past is not a sequence of events, but a texture, something sensed more than recalled. Humanity, emerging within this quiet after a forgotten age, would not inherit clear instructions, but an atmosphere, a subtle pressure guiding thought and behavior without ever announcing its source. As generation unfolded, this inherited quiet would encourage observation. The movement of water, the return of seasons, the slow repetition of stars overhead. Meaning would no longer arrive as command but as inference. Knowledge would grow slowly, shaped by attention rather than revelation. In this way, the absence of guidance becomes a form of education. Teaching, patience, humility. Stories formed in this environment would carry a different weight. They would not aim to preserve accuracy but resonance. A tale did not need to be true in detail to be useful in feeling, and so early myths would speak of beings who arrived, shaped, and then withdrew, leaving behind a world capable of continuing without them. These stories would rarely linger on reasons, because reasons imply justification, and justification invites judgment. Instead, they would describe departures as natural, almost inevitable, like dusk following daylight. In these narratives, the Anunnaki would appear less as figures with faces, and more as forces. Their significance would lie not in their actions alone, but in when they chose to stop acting. The emphasis shifts from presence to transition, from what was given to what was left open. Over time, this emphasis would become so ingrained that even the idea of direct intervention would feel disruptive, out of place within a world accustomed to quiet unfolding. As cultures spread and diverged, each would interpret this inherited silence differently. Some would fill it with ritual, attempting to recreate a sense of connection through repetition. Others would embrace it as emptiness, focusing instead on immediate survival and tangible experience. Yet beneath these differences, a shared undercurrent would remain, a sense that the world was once closer to something, and that closeness ended not with loss, but with distance. Distance has a peculiar effect on memory. It does not erase, but blurs. Details fade, while impressions remain. The Anunnaki, receding further into the past, would become less defined, their identities dissolving into archetypes. Teacher, watcher, origin, departure. These roles contradicted, without threatening the core feeling that something intentional had occurred long ago. In the absence of certainty, imagination thrives. But this imagination would be tempered by restraint. Without living authority to validate or correct beliefs, exaggeration would carry risk. Too much invention could fracture social cohesion. Too little would leave emptiness unaddressed. And so cultures would learn balance, allowing stories to evolve slowly, anchored by shared experience. It does not demand attention, yet it influences everything within it. Conversations pause differently, decisions take longer, reflections deepen. A civilization shaped by inherited quiet would value continuity over disruption. Progress would be measured not by speed, but by stability. Sudden change would feel unsettling, a break from the unspoken agreement that growth should be almost imperceptible. If the Anunnaki stepped aside deliberately, leaves lasting dependency. A world accustomed to guidance may struggle to act without it. By contrast, a world shaped by absence learns resilience. Mistakes become teachers, confusion becomes motivation. Silence becomes space for internal voices to emerge. Over time, this internalization of authority would reduce something recognized within. Elders would not claim to know ultimate truths, but to remember patterns. Knowledge would be passed through example rather than decree. The memory of ancient teachers would survive not as doctrine, but as an ethic of restraint. As millennia pass, even this ethic risks fading. Silence, once purposeful, can become assumed. New generations may forget that absence was chosen, interpreting it instead as proof that nothing was ever there. The idea of a forgotten age becomes abstract, almost philosophical, yet traces persist in the discomfort, with absolute certainty, in the hesitation before declaring final answers. These traces often surface during moments of collective uncertainty. When familiar structures fail, people look not only forward, but inward and backward. Questions arise about origins, about whether the present world is complete, unfinished. In these moments, the old stories resurface, not as literal histories, but as frameworks for undersurface. The Anunnaki, within this framework, represent a boundary rather than a presence. They mark the edge between guidance and independence, between instruction and interpretation. Their memory functions less as a reminder of power and more as a reminder of restraint. A lesson embedded so deeply that it no longer requires narration. By withholding explicit knowledge, it prevents misuse. Not all understanding is safe to hold at every stage of development. A forgotten age may have ended not because it failed, but because its continuation would have caused imbalance. Stepping aside becomes an act of care, ensuring that what follows can grow at its own pace. This perspective reframes forgetting as adaptation. It frees later generations from obligations they cannot fully comprehend. It removes the weight of comparison, enabling new solutions to emerge, without being overshadowed by ancient standards. In this sense, the fading of the Anunnaki from memory is not loss, but release. As silence deepens, it becomes indistinguishable from nature itself. Wind moves through trees without explanation. Water shapes stone without instruction. The world teaches through repetition rather than speech. Humanity, shaped by this environment, learns to read signs rather than commands. Though names change and stories fragment, the underlying pattern remains: a trust in gradual change, a respect for limits, an awareness that not everything meaningful must be articulated. The Anunnaki, if remembered at all, are remembered in this posture of restraint. This acceptance of incompleteness feels elusive. To remember them too clearly would undo their final lesson. It would reintroduce dependence where independence was intended. Silence, therefore, guards its own purpose. It resists clarity not out of neglect, but out of design. As time continues, humanity stands within this inherited quiet, often unaware of its origin, yet shaped by its influence. The forgotten age remains folded beneath the present, not as a blueprint, but as a foundation. And the act of stepping aside continues to echo, not as a voice, but as a space in which human understanding slowly, carefully unfolds. Within this long quiet, humanity begins to confuse inheritance with instinct. What was once shaped by absence becomes naturalized, as though it has always belonged to the structure of being human. People grow accustomed to carrying questions without answers, to sensing boundaries without seeing them. The forgotten age no longer feels like a memory, but like a background condition, something as subtle and unquestioned. As societies mature within this condition, they develop an unusual relationship with authority. Power is accepted when it is temporary, distrusted when it claims permanence. Leadership becomes cyclical, justified by service rather than origin. This preference does not arise from ideology, but from an inherited caution. Though its source is no longer remembered, the impulse remains. Quietly steering collective behavior, art and symbol offer another window into this inheritance. Rather than depicting clear hierarchies or definitive origins, ancient expressions often emphasize transition. Figures emerge from shadow and return to it. The absence of resolution is not accidental, but reflective of a will, shaped by stepping aside. Meaning is found not in culmination, but in passage. Language, too, bends around silence. Certain concepts resist precise definition. Words gesture, rather than conclude. This linguistic softness allows ideas to remain flexible across generations, adapting without breaking. In such a system, forgetting is not erasure, but transformation. What cannot be carried forward intact is reshaped into something lighter, something survivable. Over long stretches of time, even this softened inheritance begins to thin. Silence deepens, until it becomes indistinguishable from emptiness. The question of whether anything ever stood before humanity grows distant, almost irrelevant stem. Yet behavior continues to reflect a past no one consciously recalls. Chaucer made cautiously. Progress unfolds, incrementally. There is a persistent reluctance to force conclusions. Occasionally, individuals emerge, who sense the depth beneath this quiet. They feel that the world contains more layers than are immediately visible. Their insights are rarely precise. Instead, they speak in fragments, intuitions, and warnings. Their words resonate not because they reveal new information, but because they align with something already felt but unnamed. These moments of resonance suggest that memory does not reside only in stories, but in structures of perception, the unease, triggered by claims of total knowledge. These reactions hint at a past where such claims may have been tested, and found wanting. If the Anunnaki stepped aside to allow humanity to develop autonomy, then the true measure of their influence lies in what humanity learned to avoid. Not conquest, but dependency. Not certainty, but finality. The inherited silence teaches restraint by example, not instruction. It demonstrates that withdrawal can be as formative as presence. This lesson becomes particularly visible during periods of apparent collapse. When familiar systems falter, there is often an instinct to rebuild, rather than tends to preserve. Even radical change tends to preserve. This continuity suggests an embedded preference for adaptation over erasure, a refusal to start from nothing. The forgotten age, then, functions as a stabilizing weight. Though unseen, it anchors development. Preventing extremes, it tempers ambition with patience, innovation with caution. The absence of remembered gods or overseers does not lead to chaos, but to an inward turn, a reliance on shared observation rather than external command. As centuries pass into millennia, the idea of silence itself shifts. It is no longer perceived as a remnant of departure, but as a natural state. They forget that something chose not to speak. Yet this forgetting is itself part of the design. Awareness would invite imitation, and imitation might undermine the lesson. True stepping aside requires anonymity. To be remembered too clearly is to remain present, to influence without being recognized. The Anunnaki, if they existed as the story suggests, may have understood this deeply. Their legacy would not be preserved in names or acts, but in conditions. Conditions shape behavior more reliably than rules. They operate continuously, subtly, without requiring belief. Silence, as a condition, encourages listening. Humanity, growing within these conditions, internalizes them without conscious effort. Even when later cultures attempt to reconstruct origins, their efforts resist clarity, evidence fragments. Interpretations diverge, yet beneath debate and speculation, a shared humility persists. This humility is perhaps the most enduring inheritance of the forgotten age. It allows multiple truths to coexist. It accepts contradiction without urgency. It recognizes that understanding unfolds across time rather than arriving whole. In a world shaped by silence, certainty is less valuable. As the memory of stepping aside dissolves further, its effects become inseparable from human nature. What began as a deliberate withdrawal becomes an assumed condition. The Anunnaki, once figures of transition, fade completely from conscious when shaping thought, culture, and response. In this way, forgetting achieves what remembrance could not. It frees humanity from avarice. It removes the temptation to measure progress against an unreachable past. It allows each generation to feel that it stands at the beginning, even while building upon layers laid down long ago. Silence does not erase influence, it disguises it. It allows influence to operate. Its effects are irreversible. Humanity becomes what it is not by instruction, but by environment. The forgotten age ends not because it disappears, but because it no longer needs recognition. Its work continues invisibly, and within this continuity, the act of stepping aside proves more powerful than any act of command. The Anunnaki, remembered through nothing more than the shape of human restraint, achieve a form of permanence that presence alone could never sustain. As the forgotten age recedes beyond reach, humanity no longer senses it as history, but as atmosphere. The quiet that once marked a transition now fills every interval of thought, shaping expectations so thoroughly that its origin becomes irrelevant. People are born into this silence and learn its language without realizing they are learning anything at all. It becomes the medium through which meaning moves, unseen and unquestioned. In such a world, endings rarely feel final. Change arrives softly, layered over what came before, leaving no clean break to point to. Even loss unfolds gradually, allowing space for adaptation rather than shock. This way of moving through time reflects an inherited preference for continuity, a reluctance to sever connections completely. The absence of dramatic rupture becomes a defining feature of human experience. Over generations, this preference alters how people imagine beginnings as well. Creation is no longer viewed as a single moment of emergence, but as a slow assembling. Origins blur into processes. The idea that something once stepped aside to allow this process to continue quietly becomes almost impossible to articulate, because articulation itself implies separation. Silence resists such division. What remains is a faint orientation toward balance. Extremes feel uncomfortable. Absolutes provoke skepticism. Even conflict, when it arises, often seeks resolution through exhaustion rather than annihilation. These tendencies do not require explanation. They feel instinctive, as though written into the rhythm of human thought. If the Anunnaki were once present and then withdrew, not a set of instructions, but a direction. Not a map, but a sense of slope, gently guiding movement. Without dictating destination, humanity follows this slope, unconsciously, adjusting course as needed, rarely aware that the ground itself was shaped long before, as memory fades completely. Even the name Anunnaki, among many, the stories that once carried echoes of stepping aside, dissolve into broader themes of distance and return. Gods leave, teachers depart, elders fall silent. These narratives persist not because they preserve truth, but because they mirror an internalized expectation. Humanity does not wait indefinitely for instruction. It experiments, errs, adapts. Failure is not interpreted as abandonment, but as part of learning. The silence left behind is no longer heavy. It becomes familiar, even comforting. A space where reflection can occur without interruption, a fleeting intuition that the world has been shaped by something no longer visible. These moments pass quickly, rarely forming into coherent belief. They are absorbed into art, philosophy, or private contemplation. The silence accommodates them without resistance, allowing insight. It prevents fixation. No single interpretation hardens into dogma. The absence of authoritative memory ensures flexibility. Humanity remains capable of changing its understanding without feeling it has betrayed a foundational truth. The forgotten age, by remaining forgotten, protects this adaptability. In the long view, this may be the most enduring achievement of stepping aside. Influence that does not insist on recognition avoids corruption. It does not provoke rebellion or blind loyalty. It shapes gently, persistently, without becoming an object of desire or fear. Its success is measured not by remembrance, but by continuity. As time continues to unfold, humanity becomes increasingly self-referential. Meaning is generated internally, through shared experience rather than inherited. The future is approached cautiously, shaped by an unspoken understanding that progress should not outrun comprehension. Within this understanding, silence remains central. Not as absence, but as condition. It predicts agreement for growth. It prevents finality. It ensures that no single moment claims to be the culmination. The Anunnaki, if they existed within this speculative memory, achieve a paradoxical permanence through disappearance. By stepping aside completely, they ensure that their influence cannot be exhausted or overturned. It becomes indistinguishable from the fabric of human eventually. Even the idea of a forgotten age fades into abstraction. Time stretches so far that beginnings lose relevance. Humanity stands within an ever-present, now shaped by countless unseen decisions layered beneath awareness. The silence that once marked departure now feels like origin itself. In this state, remembrance is no longer necessary. The lesson of stipulates rather than settles. Knowledge accumulates slowly. Power remains provisional. These patterns persist without explanation. Sustained by the conditions that produce them, silence, having completed its work, does not end. It simply continues, indistinguishable from existence. The Anunnaki, remembered only through the shape of what followed them, no longer require a place, and so the story resolves not with revelation, but with quiet acceptance. The forgotten age remains forgotten, not because it failed to matter, but because it succeeded too well. Its influence flows onward without name or boundary, carried forward in the way humanity listens, waits, and chooses. It feels like the natural condition of awareness itself. Thoughts arise within it and dissolve back into it, without resistance. Memory no longer presses to be resolved. Questions no longer demand answers. What remains is a steady presence, unhurried and unafraid of incompleteness. There is no sense of loss tied to what has faded, because fading has become part of how meaning endures. The absence of clear origins does not weaken identity, it softens it. People learn to exist without anchoring themselves to definitive beginnings or promised endings. Life unfolds as continuation rather than destination. The forgotten age, once imagined as distant and unreachable, becomes indistinguishable from the present moment. Not because it has returned, but because its influence has dissolved into habit, perception, and rhythm. It no longer needs to be remembered to be effective. Its presence is felt in the ease with which uncertainty is tolerated, in the quiet trust that understanding does not need to arrive all at once. Even the idea of stepping aside loses its sharpness. What was once a deliberate act becomes a principle woven into how change is allowed to occur. Guidance appears briefly and then recedes. Insight surfaces, and then makes space for the next. Nothing insists on permanence. Everything participates in a gentle exchange between emergence and withdrawal. This exchange shapes how humanity relates to itself. Identity is no longer fixed to singular narratives. It remains open, layered, capable of revision without collapse. The absence of final authority allows multiple perspectives to coexist. Disagreement does not threaten continuity, it enriches it. As time moves forward, the pace remains slow. Not because progress is resisted, but because comprehension is valued more than acceleration. The world does not rush toward conclusions. It lingers, it listens. It waits for patterns to reveal themselves, naturally, rather than force this patience. It offers rest between moments, allowing experience to settle before being interpreted. In this space, meaning arises organically, shaped by live reality, rather than imposed structure. Humanity becomes fluent in reading subtlety, in noticing what changes, gradually, as figures, at the beginning of this unfolding, are no longer necessary as symbols. Their role has been fulfilled through disappearance. The act of stepping aside has completed its cycle. What remains is not memory of them, but the conditions their absence made possible. In these conditions, there is no urgency to reclaim what was lost, because nothing essential was taken away. What mattered was transferred into form rather than content, into ways of seeing, choosing, and waiting, into an acceptance that guidance, when it comes, should be temporary. This acceptance creates a quiet confidence. Humanity does not need to be watched to continue. It does not require constant correction. It learns through movement, through time, through reflection. Mistakes are absorbed rather than punished. Adjustments occur without the need for dramatic reckoning. As awareness deepens, silence becomes less noticeable. Precisely because it is everywhere, it is the backdrop against which all sound occurs, the stillness between breaths, the pause everything without claiming anything. In this holding, the forgotten age rests, not as a chapter to be reopened, but as a foundation that no longer needs inspection. Its influence is stable, self-sustaining. It does not fade further, nor does it return. It simply remains embedded, doing its quiet work. The story, if it can still be called a story, does not end with revelation. There is no final understanding waiting just beyond reach. Instead, there is continuity. A sense that what matters most unfolds slowly, overspans too long to be measured by single lives. This continuity offers peace rather than closure. It allows the listener to let go of the need to know precisely what happened. It suggests that understanding is not something to be completed, but something to be lived within. And so the narrative settles into stillness, not silence as absence, but silence as fullness, a space where memory no longer presses forward, and anticipation remains. carrying within it every step that came before. Here, the act of stepping aside is complete. The forgotten age has finished speaking by never speaking again, and humanity, shaped gently by that choice, continues forward without needing to look back. The quiet holds, the world breathes, and nothing more is required.